Welcome back to another reaction video. So let's watch this video, the GOAT of every role in WWE history. Let's watch.
WWE has been around for a long time, and over the course of the decades, many different people have filled many different on-screen roles there, whether it be the main event star, commentator, authority figure, but just who is the GOAT of each and every role in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the greatest to ever play the role of main event superstar, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, there are a lot of names that could have been placed here, like Hulk Hogan, The Rock, or any one of the countless other great main eventers who have wrestled for the WWE over the years. But in the end, it could only really be one person for the role, and that's the Rattlesnake himself. Why is this? Well, because in Steve Austin, you have quite possibly the greatest wrestler of all time, and more importantly to WWE, the man who saved them from going under back in 1997. And we don't mean that symbolically either. No, back at that point, Vince McMahon's company was never closer to going out of business. Seriously, there was a point in the autumn of that year when the USA Network had made the decision to boot Raw off the air, something which would have left the company in the direst of dire straits. And the only reason they decided to renege on this decision was because Austin suddenly caught fire and the ratings began to move in an upward direction again, upwards to the point that by the time 1998 rolled around, things were on fire. But it's not just business reasons that make us want to list Stone Cold as the greatest main eventer in WWE history. No, there's also the fact that fans just loved him more than they did anyone else in that spot. Sure, guys like The Rock and John Cena will always be over, and people like The Hitman or Shawn Michaels might have been better in-ring performers, but there was something special about Austin, which none of these people were able to replicate. He caught on to something back in the late 90s with his anti-authority character. That's right, back at the turn of the millennium, Steve Austin was nothing less than a cultural icon. No one got bigger pops than him whenever he came through the curtain, and not one single figure got fans to tune into Raw in the same numbers. And this has meant that even now, decades after his retirement, whenever he shows up on an episode of Raw, he's still often the most over person there by a mile. So popular does he remain, in fact, he even got to main event WrestleMania all over again in 2022, when at WrestleMania 38, he made a one-night return to the ring in his home state of Texas to challenge and defeat Kevin Owens. All of this is to say then that of all the main eventers who have worked for WWE over the years, none have ever felt like a bigger deal than the Rattlesnake. After all, during the period where the industry was the hottest it had ever been, it was him who was standing at the top of the mountain and carrying everything on his shoulders. That said, every great hero needs a villain who's just as great. Where would Batman be without the Joker, for example? Or where might Luke Skywalker be without Darth Vader? And that's why back in the 90s, a great authority figure was required to challenge Austin. And this authority figure just so happens to be the greatest in WWE history, Mr. McMahon himself. That's right, the on-screen character of Mr. McMahon was the perfect heel foil to our hero Stone Cold. Sure, there were other choices for this entry, like Teddy Long or Eric Bischoff, but in the end, there was only one real option for the #1 spot. And that's because while all of those other authority figures played their roles well, none of them played it even half as well as Vince did. After all, he was the one who took the whole thing to cartoon levels of supervillainy during the turn of the millennium period. And this made him a perfect foil to the Rattlesnake then, because with Austin being nothing short of beloved by audiences and in many ways being the man they could vicariously live their lives through, McMahon being such a heel made it so much more satisfying to watch as he got his regular comeuppance.
This was too perfect.
Who wouldn't watch scenes like Austin drowning Vince with a beer bath, making him urinate himself on live TV, or destroying his car with cement and not think that it would be great to be able to do that to their own boss back then? No, there was also the fact that there was plenty of reality to the situation whenever he was on screen, because unlike with a Teddy Long or a Jack Tunney, we knew he was the one who was actually in charge of things in real life too. So when he stood in opposition to someone like Daniel Bryan at the start of the Yes Movement then, fans knew this was in many ways his real feelings towards the American Dragon, something which made it all the easier to boo him. And the same could also be said of his programs with people like Mick Foley, CM Punk, and others too. Yes, it was this which made him the best at this role he played on screen. But let's move away from authority figures and back to wrestlers again, as next we want to look at the mid-card and see who was the best to ever fight in the division over the years in WWE. Needless to say then,
The gimmicks
this is
are
an
so
incredibly hard
good.
task, maybe the hardest of them all, but there's only one perfect choice in the end, Mr. Perfect. Yes, there are so many options for this entry, it can be near impossible to narrow it down to one. Come on now, over the years, the WWE mid-card has included people like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, Chris Jericho, and Eddie Guerrero, just to name a few. But while most, if not all of these wrestlers eventually found themselves reaching the main event scene, the same cannot be said of Mr. Perfect.
All these,
no, throughout his entire run under Vince McMahon's employ, Kurt Hennig remained in that mid-card role, and the fact he remained here, constantly propping up the division when he could have very easily rose to the top of the card, makes him perfect at the role. It would be like if Shawn Michaels had spent his entire career deciding not to challenge for the world title, but instead just choosing to raise up the people lower down than him to that next level. Seriously, when you look at the people Kurt elevated back during the 80s and 90s alone, it's a who's who of the people who would eventually go on to carry WWE, with perhaps the biggest example of this being the matches he had with Bret Hart over the Intercontinental title. And that title is also an important factor in choosing Mr. Perfect as WWE's greatest mid-carder, because it was at this time it became one of the most prized belts in all of wrestling. And the reason for that was because it was very much considered the workhorse belt which great in-ring performers wanted to hold. Obviously then, this was a belt that Kurt Hennig himself held at one point then, and when he did, he would do everything he could to give it that reputation with some of the most state-of-the-art matches anyone had seen at the time. Yes, while the bigger names over in the main event scene might have been more popular, if you wanted to see the best in-ring work back during the golden era, then Mr. Perfect was the man. But not every wrestler has to be great in a traditional sense in order to be considered a GOAT of WWE. No, when it comes to our next entry, the Brooklyn Brawler, he earned his spot in this video by becoming the best jobber the promotion ever had.
Oh my god.
That's right. This is a somewhat more lighthearted entry, as to be the best in this category, you don't have to be a maestro in the ring. Hell, you don't even have to be over in a major way. No, all you have to be is the best of the worst. Of course, that's not to suggest there haven't been a lot of great jobber acts in WWE over the years. The likes of Barry Horowitz, Heath Slater, and Kurt Hawkins will attest to this. But none of these people ever had quite the same level of specialness that Steve Lombardi did. What was this specialness? Well, it was an almost intangible quality which made audiences watch The New Yorker during the late 80s and early 90s, see him always lose in short squash matches, and still fall in love with him regardless.
Wow.
It's a peculiar thing because had most other people been put in this role, they'd be considered a footnote to history. In Lombardi's case, though, he always managed to maintain some sense of relevance, particularly when he was in the guise of his most famous incarnation, the Brooklyn Brawler. So because of this then, while other jobbers would come and go with the company, the Brawler remained a constant presence throughout the dying days of the Golden Era and the entirety of the New Generation era. Hell, he'd even be there when the Attitude Era was starting to kick into full gear in 1998. And it was just prior to this, in 1997, that, as a reward for all his years of looking up at the lights for bigger, more focused upon stars, he'd finally be given his moment in the sun when at a house show in Madison Square Garden that November, he'd get to challenge then WWF champion Shawn Michaels for the gold. Once that was over, though, it would be back to his normal role of being a jobber extraordinaire, a role the New Yorker remained in right until he left the company the following year. Could he have been more? Maybe yes, but we're glad this was the role Steve had, because had he ever truly risen to the level of mid-carder, he'd likely have gotten lost among a sea of other performers at this level. With him being the perennial jobber, however, he was able to remain king of his own island, even if this meant he'd be a big fish in a small pond in many respects.
Wow.
And if nothing else, that earns him a spot on today's video, as it makes him the GOAT in a very specific category of WWE performer.
Wow.
But what about the GOAT of another category? A category that moves away from the ring and over to the advocacy role. Well, that's our next entry as it happens. And when it comes to the best manager in WWE history, that entry is reserved for Paul Heyman. That's right. While there have been many great managers throughout WWE history, names like Bobby Heenan, Sensational Sherry, and Jim Cornette, the fact is none of them ever managed 4 world champions. In the case of Paul Heyman, though, he did just this. Sure, one of those champions, The Big Show, isn't remembered for his time under Heyman's wing much today, but when it comes to the other 3, well, they're still very much associated with him. That's right, whether we're talking about Brock Lesnar, CM Punk, or Roman Reigns, all of them arguably did their best work while the wise man was standing in their corner. Just look back at that meteoric rise Brock had when he first debuted on the WWE main roster way back in 2002. There's a reason he became undisputed champion after less than 6 months in the company, and that reason is because the guy making all the plays for him knew exactly what he was doing. So when Brock returned to WWE years later following a successful run in UFC, it wouldn't take him long to get Paul back on his side. By this point, though, the New Yorker was about to branch out to working with other clients too. And one of these would be the man who was then in the midst of a 434-day-long run as WWE Champion, CM Punk. How would working with Heyman change Punk?
I know that relationship
it would
was
extend
something.
his run on top for one. And it would lead to a friendship developing which exists until this day, both on screen and off. But even that isn't Heyman's finest hour as a manager. No, his finest hour came when, in 2020, he became the wise man of Roman Reigns, and in the process, turned things around for him in a big way. You see, before this point, Roman had been struggling to get over as a top guy in a big way. Almost immediately after shacking up with the former ECW owner, however, this changed as he transformed into the Tribal Chief, the dominating force in all of WWE. And with him winning the Universal title soon thereafter, and then later unifying that with the WWE title, what the head of the table would end up doing by the time all was said and done was go on a run on top that lasted for a full 1,316 days, the fourth longest in WWE history, behind Hulk Hogan, Bob Backlund, and Bruno Sammartino.
That is insane.
And this is a sign of how great of a manager Paul is. And that's exactly why he's one step ahead of all the other greats who filled similar roles in WWE at this point. Sure, there's always the chance that someone will come along in the future who's better than even him.
I love it.
But until that happens, he'll remain the king of his role. Who knows, maybe he'll even add more top-level clients to his roster before he hangs up his advocacy hat for good. Can we discount the idea of Paul Heyman standing in the corner of someone like a Braun Breaker one day? But let's move away from him for now and over to another GOAT of WWE who fills a non-wrestling role, the best man to ever sit behind the commentary booth, good old JR, Jim Ross. Yes, this one seemed like a home run choice in many ways because while there has been a lot of great commentators in WWE over the years, names like Gorilla Monsoon, Bobby Heenan, and Michael Cole, there's only one person who was the voice of what was arguably the most popular era in wrestling history, the Attitude Era, and that's JR. Why is Jim Ross held in such high regard? Well, if the role of a commentator is to add the lyrics to the music which has been provided by the in-ring performers, then he was on the level of a Tom Waits or Lin-Manuel Miranda. All you have to do is think back to some of those iconic calls he made in the 90s and 2000s, such as God is my witness, he's broken in half," when Mick Foley came crashing down off the Hell in a Cell. "Climb the ladder, kid, make yourself famous," when it looked like Jeff Hardy was about to win the undisputed title from The Undertaker. And "The Austin Era has begun," when Stone Cold came out on top at WrestleMania 14. Each of them is drilled into the memory of every wrestling fan, and they're part of the reason why the Attitude Era is remembered so fondly today. Yes, if you take this one element out of the equation, then wrestling's most popular mainstream period likely doesn't feel as special. And that's a testament to just how great JR was at his job. But then he was always great at his job even before this, when he was working in places like Mid-South Wrestling and WCW, doing a far more sports style of presentation. And while he's no longer at his peak, to this day he remains a valuable figure over on AEW, where he can be brought in to call the occasional big match and lend it an air of gravitas that it might not otherwise have. All of this is to say that when the book is written on wrestling one day, there will be an entire chapter dedicated to Jim Ross, so great has his contributions been to the industry. And for a man who rarely laced up his boots and stepped into the ring in any real matches, that's quite an achievement. The only question left then is, will he ever make a return there to WWE before all is said and done? We'll have to wait and see. Yes, at this point, he's almost as big of a legend as our next subjects, our pick for the greatest tag team in WWE history. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Legion of Doom, of course. What made the Legion of Doom so special? Well, the answer to that question is there simply was no one like them in the sense that they were so catastrophically over. Yes, there's a reason the phrase Road Warrior Pop was created to explain the mammoth ovations Hawk and Animal got whenever they came out through the curtain while working in the old territory system. And these pops would be just as loud once they eventually came to WWF during the early 90s. Hell, there's a reason why when the company went to Wembley Stadium in 1992 to hold that year's SummerSlam, the Legion of Doom were the performers chosen to kick off the show, as Vince McMahon knew they'd get the crowd pumped up in a way that no one else could. But then it's not just crowd pops that make a team great. No, it's also the success they had while in the ring. And luckily for the LOD, they were also great in this regard too. That's right, while tag team wrestling has never really been much of a focus in WWE, whenever Hawk and Animal were there, they made themselves the focus. And they did this by becoming WWF Tag Team Champions on 2 separate occasions. Sure, it could be said that there are other great tag teams who have won more titles in the WWE, names like the Hardy Boys, the Dudley Boys, or the Usos, but at their peak, the Legion of Doom may have been more over with fans than all of them. And while those teams were undeniably great, the pairing of Hawk and Animal is something which has never really been able to be fully replicated since, no matter how much every promoter under the sun has tried. Take 2 big, mean-looking guys and have them beat everyone up and no-sell in the process. It just worked when it was them in a way it never worked for anyone else. Sadly, though, given both Hawk and Animal have now passed away, we're never going to get to see them do their thing again. And that's a true tragedy because it means the GOATs of tag team wrestling will never have that final run. But what about women's wrestling?
It's too unique.
After all, that's something which has been making great strides within recent years. Well, for the greatest of all time, we only have to look at the Queen, Charlotte Flair. Yes, while others such as Becky Lynch, Rhea Ripley, or Trish Stratus could have also earned the top spot here, none of those performers have the accomplishments that Charlotte has. Yes, if you were to make a list of the top 10 women's matches in history, at least half of them would be bouts involving her. We're talking about her WrestleMania 39 match against Rhea Ripley, her Evolution match against Becky Lynch, and her Raw Falls Count Anywhere match against Sasha Banks. And that's not the end of the list of opponents the Queen has brought the best out of over the years. No, she's also delivered against the likes of Io Sky, Ronda Rousey, Bayley, and Bianca Belair too. And that's why, as it stands today, she holds the record for the most world title reigns of any woman on the roster, with her current total standing at 14, 16 if we count her 2 NXT women's title runs. Obviously then, this puts her in rarefied air, the kind which can only really be shared by the likes of John Cena and her father Ric Flair. Unlike them though, Charlotte still has plenty of years left on the clock. And this means we're likely to see her add more reigns to her list before all is said and done. Seriously, by the time she retires, we could be talking about the Queen as someone who's had 20+ runs on top. And if that happens, there'll simply be no denying anymore that she truly is the best woman to ever step foot inside a WWE ring. Even if that doesn't happen though, she's still going to be great because her resume already speaks volumes about where she's at and who she is. And who she is a once-in-a-generation level talent, someone who's so great, even at a time when women's wrestling has never been stronger, she still stands out above the rest of the pack. But then we guess the same could be said about all the people we've looked at today, because they all stand at the top of their respective roles in WWE. And that's exactly what makes them the best at what they do.
I love that this video did not just focus on wrestlers, and it gave, different roles their credit, their flowers or whatever. Because I was just thinking wrestlers, but he pointed out the commentators and stuff like that. So I really like the fact that he, didn't just focus on wrestlers. But that was going to do it for this reaction, you guys. Make sure to leave some likes and comments down below. Let me know what you guys think, and I will see y'all in the next one. Toodles.